since a poor widow housekeeper, all whose property did not perhaps exceed the value of £50, paid as much as the wealthiest merchant, who had thousands of pounds worth of goods in his stores. I proposed the hiring of proper men to serve constantly in the business, and the levying of a tax should be proportioned to the property. This idea being approved by the junto was communicated to the other clubs, the junto tentacles I may call them, the other clubs, but as originating in each of them, as though the plan was not immediately carried into execution, right? So just it introduced to these other clubs this policy. We've all voted on it, and yay, we say it's a policy to go for. They introduced it into the other clubs and quote, "Yet by preparing the minds of the people for the change it paved the way for the law obtained a few years after, when the members of our club were grown into more influence." So in time, the growth of influentiality of the members, since all this ground was prepared, and sort of without the idea that we're part of a big group, but sort of the idea that this is grassroots, we just have this idea here. About this time I wrote a paper, first to be read in the junto, but it was afterwards published, on the ways in which houses were set on fire. He says it more verbosely, but that's what it means, with cautions against these. So he says it. Wrote a paper cautioning people how not to let your house burn down. This was spoken of as a useful piece, and gave rise to a project which soon followed it of forming a company for the more ready extinguishing of fires and mutual assistance in removing and securing of goods when in danger. Our articles of agreement obliged every member to keep always in good order and fit for use a certain number of leathern buckets with strong bags and baskets for packing and transporting of goods, which were to be brought to every fire. So we all agreed we're going to have a certain amount of equipment privately on hand. We're just going to, we do this for the better of our community, and then each one of these people introduced it in their junto clubs. And then they agreed that about once a month they would have a night discussing fire safety and fire stuff, fireobilia, fire stuff. The utility of this institution soon appeared, and many more desiring to be admitted than we thought convenient for one company, they were advised to form another, and thus went on one new company after another till they became so numerous as to include most of the inhabitants who were men of property. And now, at the time of my writing this, though upward of 50 years since its establishment, that which I first formed, called the Union Fire Company, still subsists, though the first members are all deceased but one, who is older by a year than I am. The fines that have been paid by members for absence at the monthly meetings have been applied to the purchase of fire engines, ladders, fire hooks, and other useful implements for each company, so that I question whether there is a city in the world better provided with the means of putting a stop to beginning conflagrations. And in fact, since these institutions, the city has never lost by fire more than 1 or 2 houses at a time, and the flames have often been extinguished before the house in which they began has been half consumed. So it became one of the safest cities on the planet because of this idea. Chapter 8, page 99. In 1739 arrived among us from Ireland Reverend Mr. Whitefield, who had made himself remarkable there as an itinerant preacher. He was at first permitted to preach in some of our churches, but the clergy, taking a dislike to him, soon refused him their pulpits, and he was obliged to preach in the fields. Now, it seems this guy awakened everybody up into a bit of a fervor. Quote, "From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in different families of every street." So, a little reawakening this guy brought to Philadelphia. So he goes into the initiative to get a building built, which was expressly, quote, "for the use of any preacher of any religious persuasion who might desire to say something to the people at Philadelphia." Skip down just a bit. So that even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send a missionary to preach Mohammedanism to us, he would find a pulpit at his service. So we'll take anybody. This is the ideal of free speech. But I wrote here, when I read this, I wrote terrorism. Would they allow him to preach terrorism? Moving down several pages, page 103 now. My business was now constantly augmenting, and my circumstance growing daily easier, my newspaper having become very profitable, as being for a time almost the only one in this and the neighboring provinces. I experienced, too, the truth of the observation that, quote, after getting the first £100, it is more easy to get the second. Money itself being of a prolific nature. So, money sticks to itself. The more you have, the more sticky it gets. The partnership at Carolina having succeeded, I was encouraged to engage in others and to promote several of my workmen who had behaved well by establishing them in printing houses in different colonies in the same terms with that in Carolina. Most of them did well, being enabled at the end of our term, 6 years, to purchase the types from me, he says, and go on working for themselves, by which means several families were raised. That's interesting to put it that way. By which means several families were raised. In other words, this contributed a living to people who went on and actually made utility of it in life. Productivity is a virtue. So he says he likes Pennsylvania, he likes having been set up there, but there were, quote, no provision for defense, nor for a complete education of youth, no militia, nor any college. I therefore in 1743 drew up a proposal for establishing an academy, and at that time thinking the Reverend Richard Peters, who was out of employ, a fit person to superintend, I communicated the project to him. So he wanted this guy to be the principal. However, he had a more profitable idea for the property, and it ended up going to some other use. So I let the scheme lie a while dormant. I succeeded better the next year, 1744, in proposing and establishing a philosophical society. The paper I wrote for that purpose will be found among my writings, if not lost with many others. With respect to defense, Spain had been several years at war against Great Britain, and being at length joined by France, this brought us into great danger. Now, he's actually got a very long run-on sentence, and I've cut it into 3 sentences, and I've changed the tense of 3 different words. But that's of no, I mean, you know, if you want the autobiography, go read the autobiography, but I'm making it digestible here for us. So, he says, with respect to defense, Spain had been several years at war with Great Britain, and at length was joined by France. So now all the great nations of Europe are fighting each other, and there's just no safe place on the seas for us, and we might be attacked at any time. We were a colony of Great Britain, of course, at the time still. So and then he says, quote, the long continued endeavor of our governor, Thomas, to prevail with our Quaker Assembly to pass a militia law and make other provisions for the security of the province had proved abortive. So because in Pennsylvania there was a large amount of Quakers, you know, the pacifists, and they just couldn't get a militia bill to pass because they were pacifists. They don't believe you should ever resist evil. I proposed to try what might be done by a voluntary subscription of the people. To promote this, I first wrote and published a pamphlet entitled Plain Truth, in which I stated our helpless situation in strong lights, with the necessity of union and discipline for our defense, and promised to propose in a few days an association to be generally signed for that purpose. The pamphlet had a sudden and surprising effect. I was called upon for the instrument of association. So they said, Franklin, you've got a good idea. Why don't you be the person who's at the center of this bit? Having settled the draft of it with a few friends, I appointed a meeting of the citizens of the large building mentioned before, the one they built for anybody who wanted to speak to the people of Philadelphia. The house was pretty full. I had prepared a number of printed copies and provided pens and inks dispersed all over the room. I harangued them a little while on the subject, read the paper, explained it, then distributed the copies, which were eagerly signed, not the least objection being made. Now he harangued them in favor of a position he was trying to get them to adopt. What does he mean by harangue? From compact Oxford English, means to criticize at length in an aggressive manner. So basically he was at length saying